Warm greetings to you today. I have one favor to ask as you watch. I wonder if you would stay with me as we go. Don't assume that what I'm going to say is what I'm going to say. Stay with me. Last week, the nation of Israel suffered a brutal attack by Hamas, a political and militant organization which governs the Gaza Strip, one of two Palestinian territories. Hamas won the Palestinian election in 2006 based on its promise to use armed resistance to end Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. But the events of last week go way beyond armed resistance by any reasonable estimation. This is really incomprehensible evil. I mean, we have to ask what makes it possible for a human being to kill babies so cruelly or children so easily and then burn their bodies. What kind of depravity is this? One understands political frustration and all the things that go with it, but what depravity is this? What kind of hatred is this? To kidnap families to use simply as collateral in the event of needing to execute someone, or raping to humiliate, using people as things. What darkness is this? Terrorism is far too inadequate a word. I think it's the wrong word all round. Our scriptures give us another word for these events. The word is, of course, evil. Evil. And no matter where you stand in the politics of Israel and Palestine, and I recognize the point of the sermon today is that this is an issue which is deeply complex. No one with any sense of humanity can find this kind of behavior acceptable in any way. Surely it can't be justified in any way. The biblical scholar N.T. Wright says, when people deny the humanity of others, they become evil themselves. Whenever we treat people as things, we become evil ourselves. So in our gospel reading today, it's the story of Jesus on his way to the cross. After Judas betrays Jesus, the crowd around Jesus, which would have included his disciples, of course, could see what was about to happen. They could see that the Judas kiss had started a thing. They could see this was a setup and it was going only one way. So they asked Jesus, they want to intervene, and they say to Jesus, should we strike with our swords? And I've always found it significant that some of Jesus' followers were sword carriers. That was, he had them with him. And then one of them, in another gospel, we're told that it was Peter, but one of them gets hold of a sword and cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And I love that little piece of extra information we're given, that it is the servant of the high priest who gets wounded in the skirmish. He's just an innocent bystander. This is not his fight. He's almost certainly there just because his boss was there and he had to go along with his boss. And it's such a true parable that with violence, there will always be innocent bystanders. And Jesus' response, which is where we want to focus our attention today, Jesus' response to this act of violence is no more of this. No more of this. And he touched the man's ear and healed him. That was Jesus' response to the violence of those who came to arrest him. No more of this. And he healed the man's ear. In the Gospel of John, in that same story, Jesus says, put your sword away. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, put your sword back in its place. But in Luke's version, and I love it, and it's the one we're sticking with today, is Jesus says, no more of this. And when we think about the events of the last week, when we think of these atrocities that we hear, and I'll get to the other side in a moment, but when we hear of the atrocities that Hamas has committed, these incomprehensibly evil deeds, we find ourselves it's easy to shout, Amen, of course, no more of this. But when we think of ourselves, or we think about the things that we care for, the side we put ourselves on, it starts to get a little more complicated, a little harder. Because even as Israel has suffered so terribly by this attack, Jesus unsettlingly says to them too, no more of this. No more of this. No more denying food and water and electricity to 1 million children. No more. No more of this. For most of Christian history, followers of Jesus have actually been quite divided over the matter of war. It's not an easy subject, and we have 2,000 years of history to prove that. St. Augustine famously introduced the idea of a just war, a war which could be fought, to simplify things, a war which could be fought with certain rules in place to make a war, if you like, more decent as possible, even we might say to make it a war more Christian, to have kind of a Christian ethic to it. The sense of Augustine saying this is inevitable and let's try and put some rules in place. Martin Luther, the famous reformer, said, and this is a somewhat edited quote just to make it simpler, but he said, if anyone attempted to rule the world by the gospel, in other words, if anyone tried to rule the world strictly according to what Jesus says, he said, what would he be doing? He would be loosing the ropes and chains of the savage wild beasts and letting them bite and mangle everyone. In other words, Luther saw no practicality to the teachings of Jesus when it came to war. He argued that war is a plague, but war prevents an even greater plague than that. In other words, war is necessary to keep order. It's a reality with which we need to live and embrace as part of our Christian walk. Reinhold Niebuhr argued that war simply revealed the inescapable truth of human nature. In other words, we cannot escape it. It is who we are. We will war with one another. And so for all of John Lennon's imaginings in his famous song, A World Without War is indeed impossible to imagine, says Niebuhr. But Jesus says, no more of this. No more of this. Within the Christian church, there's this wide belief in war. We'd be surprised if we gave ourselves some time to think about it, that perhaps it is true that more often than not it is violence that we believe saves us more than Jesus. There are those, and I'll be cheeky enough just to abbreviate things to say it this way, that there are those who misread the book of Revelation, and they are convinced that Jesus is going to return as some mighty warrior, and he'll lead the armies of God in one great final battle of Armageddon. Everything leads in their minds to a great war, and God will be the warring champion. There are those in the Christian community who think that the modern state of Israel, the one that we are so aware of today, that the modern state of Israel is the same as the Israel of the Old Testament, and that therefore to defend Israel is to defend God and to defend God's purposes. And that means that Israel's retaliatory violence, even in this context, becomes holy violence. It becomes violence in God's name. It becomes justified violence. And yet, in our gospel passage for today, Jesus says, no more of this. Jesus absolutely refused to use evil to defeat evil. And we need to be clear that was why Jesus went to the cross. Instead of simply calling on all the angels and his divine power to destroy his enemies, which is suggested in the Gospels he could have done, he chooses not to do so for a reason. Because he will not use power, he will not use violence to defeat violence. No more of this. Of course, and understandably, you can count me as one of those amongst the crowd. Many will say that is Jesus not being entirely unrealistic. It's a lovely idea, but when life comes down, and I think that's what people like Luther and Augustine and others were saying. I mean, how could Israel be expected to do nothing in the face of such terrible barbarism? Should America have remained passive after 9/11? Should the world have let Adolf Hitler just continue unhindered? And many more circumstances. The thing is this, for followers of Jesus, I think at the end of the day, the question we have to ask ourselves is, in whom or in what do we honestly put our trust? In whom or in what do we honestly put our trust? Stanley Hauerwas, the celebrated Christian ethicist, says when Christians no longer believe that Christ's sacrifice is sufficient for the salvation of the world, we will find other forms of sacrificial behaviors, like war. Hear that again. When Christians no longer believe that Christ's sacrifice is sufficient for the salvation of the world, we will turn to violence to save us. When we give up on the ways of Jesus, we will allow ourselves to justify the violence of our lives. And so in these times, and these really, I think, in the greater history of the 21st century, the events of the last week will stand out. And in such terribly tragic times, it is most often not God to whom we look. We most often turn to violence to save us. And so I want to end today just briefly in this difficult in the sense of saying there are no easy answers here. I wondered, is there a word for us? Is there something that we can take away? And I want to leave you with just 3 simple thoughts. Number 1, can I encourage you in your own thinking around the Israel-Palestine issue? Don't oversimplify an impossibly complicated situation. As Hamas perpetrates their unimaginable atrocities, Israel is responding with her own brand of cruelty. Even as Israel claims their right to the land, so do the Palestinians. And we need to remember that skilled, informed negotiators have for decades worked very hard to try to find peace. And the answer is not as simple as it sounds. If it were, it would have been found. And so before you easily take the side of anyone, and particularly anyone with a sword, can I ask you to just, in the midst of this, listen for the voice of Jesus, the one who has for 2,000 years said no more of this, and wonder if there is some way in which we can respond to what is happening here. The second thing I would want to say is the word of Jesus in this context is not just for the war between these 2 nations, between these 2 peoples. For example, I'm horrified by my own propensity for revenge. In recent years, for the very first time in my life, certainly the first time in my life I can remember, I've had to confront a genuine desire to harm someone who caused me harm. I could feel it in me. Violence and retaliation, I was to discover, are present in most and probably all of us. And it's wise to remember that these events remind us of that. And although I live with someone who believes deeply in the death penalty, and I want to tell you, I'm often tempted to join her, although I don't agree with the fundamental proposition, I do recognize that when someone beats up an 89-year-old lady just 2 weeks before her 90th birthday, or a hungry man decides to kill a young woman to buy food and drugs, or gangs shoot indiscriminately and kill children on the streets, then the desire for revenge is really not that far away. We call for it in respectable ways like the death penalty. But this desire for violence is in us. Jesus, I think, would say to us today, we cannot cure violence with more violence. And then the final one, I had to think very hard about whether I could leave you with this word, because the things about which we speak today are so tragic that this could seem trite, and I want to always avoid being trite. But our psalm that we are reading in church today encourages this for us, and so I want to encourage you for it. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And I want to remind us that to pray for the peace of Jerusalem is to pray for the peace of Palestine. For the God to whom we pray is not only a God of peace, but also a God of justice. Pray especially for the hate-filled warmongers, for whoever it is that sees people as things and seeks to harm. Pray for them especially. I'm not sure that those of us on the southern tip of Africa, I'm not sure there's much more we can do right now. But maybe, if the ancient words of the psalm are to be trusted and are true, then perhaps praying for the peace of Jerusalem right now is all we can do and is enough. God be with you.